Hi, everyone. I hope all is well. My thoughts and prayers are going out to everyone who, like me, are hopefully staying at home and connecting with family and really spending some time, hopefully watching some incredible films. So I thought it would be a great opportunity to connect and dive in into some of what I think are the best films that I've seen in my lifetime. And for someone who grew up watching movies, who always wanted to go to film school, become a filmmaker, study films, really dive deep into that art form, that list is quite expansive. So my first little spiel here is about Night of the Living Dead. And when we think about what's happening in our world today, which is, pressingly important, I never thought in my lifetime, especially as a husband and a father to two kids, that I would be experiencing this. But here we are experiencing it, and it brings about a lot of concerns, a lot of our anxieties, a lot of our individual fears, our collective fears. There's some real things happening, and we want the best for people, not just in our local communities, but globally. And within that conversation rests the context of horror. So to appreciate popular film in general, as I say with my students, or when I was in the classroom working with students, it's to understand that it rises from the political. And this is something that Anne Lancashire, an academic at the University of Toronto, shared with me as a mentor who's worked with my students, that when we are exploring any form of popular culture, we have to have an understanding of context. We have to have an understanding of time and setting. So, for example, if you're going to explore Steven Spielberg's 1975 film Jaws, then you need to really then understand what was happening within that time that Spielberg made the film. So when we think about then film studies, to understand genre is quite pressing, because genre becomes a mirror and a reflector onto ourselves. It's not just a category of popular film. It's not just a category of graphic novel or, video game even. It is really about our shared experience, and genre does hold different meanings. So different genres hold different meaning. Different genres are codified and are shaped culturally. They're recycled and they're reimagined based on audience reception. So a genre may kind of fade in popularity as a audience doesn't buy into it, but then it may kind of resonate and reform new meaning. So if you think about the Western, it's been popular at times and then it's kind of faded. If you think about the slasher film of the 1970s, American slasher film, it was popular for a time, it faded, and then it kind of resurged in the mid-90s with Scream, and then it was around for a bit, then it faded, and then it came back. So we really want to have an understanding that if we're going to dive deeply into a film like Night of the Living Dead, we understand genre, we understand that film studies is a cultural studies, it's a social science. It's not just a visual and auditory art form, but it's grounded in stories and meaning and purpose. So now that brings us to Night of the Living Dead. So first, if you're at home, and hopefully you're at home and you're looking for some great reads, we have The Dread of Difference, which is available on Google Books. And there's a preview of it. This is by Barry Keith Grant, who I've been privileged to have, who was one of my lecturers when I was at Brock University in the film program. He's quite an all-star when it comes to film genre. And then I also have here a book that he edited about Robin Wood. And Robin Wood was one of his mentors, and really the godfather of kind of bringing horror film, contemporary horror film, within an academic discourse in the late 60s and 70s. Really, really important thinker that really brought contemporary horror film into an academic spotlight. So these are two kind of great reads that you can purchase or look into or try to find online. And in both those books that I just shared, Barry Keith Grant, he talks about horror rising from the political. He reaches back into a post-World War I Germany, where German expressionism was born as an expression of anxieties and fears of a Germany post-World War I, a war that they lost, a war that they were kind of the villain within, if you will, as a nation. And so what does that mean for people? What does that mean for countrymen, country person? And what was happening in Germany during the occupation of the Allies then really spoke to an angst and a feeling of malaise and cultural fragmentation and loss in the people. And there was therefore a movement of film that was born that expressed a shared anxiety, or rather individual anxiety even of the particular filmmakers who produce these films. So when we look at a film like Night of the Living Dead, we have to recognize its kind of genesis in terms of it was influenced by those early German expressionism films of a post-World War I Germany. And then it was influenced by Hollywood's appropriation of German expressionism during the Depression era films of the Universal monster classics. So the Draculas, the Wolfman, the Frankensteins. There's aesthetics borrowed there with its color tone. The fact that Romero, he shot it in a very kind of guerrilla style, black and white, his camera angles, his sense of use of aesthetic and sound design. And then here we are in this contemporary setting of 1968, and culturally what's happening. What is this film rising out of? So I'll break it up in a couple of segments. One, think about culturally what's happening in the 1960s. This is a film that came out in 1968. So if we're going to understand it within a horror context, within a genre context, what's happening in the 1960s? Well, one, you have kind of this America at the beginning of the 1960s, which is booming. It's the post-World War boom. You have the birth of suburbia. You have this new realization of the American family and what that potentially looks like. Obviously very conservative, obviously very regressive, obviously shaped by racial boundaries and prejudice. So we have this kind of Leave It to Beaver Cleaver experience, if you will. And that is the white family in suburbia, the white picket fence, dad goes to work, mom stays at home. That existence was being shaped culturally. So at the beginning of the 60s, that's what existed. But then things started to change. We had the heightened fear of the Cold War. You had, an increased and a more, if I say, impassioned conversation about civil rights, which was needed most obviously, but created, quite a bit of tension. You had, secret wars being fought that led to the crisis of Vietnam. You had the assassination of JFK, which was very much, a figure of new hope and new beginning within the United States, John F. Kennedy. You had the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. You had the assassination of Malcolm X. You had the assassination of Robert Kennedy. So for a decade that started with a lot of promise, the 1960s, it really started to fragment in a pool of great despair. And then you have Night of the Living Dead. And you have this film that starts off with two young people going to a cemetery to meet the father that seemingly they don't quite know or remember affectionately, and they don't really respect, the place of the cemetery and what it represents. So that alone is quite telling, because here we have Romero, especially Johnny. Barbara's more quiet about her thinking. She doesn't really like Johnny's sensibilities, his sense of humor, but it's quite obvious that Johnny does not have a respect for the dead. He does not have a respect for his father. He is kind of this, in the words of Leonard Cohen, beautiful loser, so to speak. So I would argue that Johnny represents kind of the failure of, the hippie movement, if you will. He represents this perhaps educated person who, through a lack of life experience, doesn't have a real understanding of what's happening or what that place of the cemetery represents. So he doesn't have much respect for death. And this could equate quite readily and quite easily to the experience with Vietnam, where you had soldiers returning home and not feeling respected by young Americans who did not fight in the war, who perhaps were against the war or were in school and they weren't part of a draft initially, whatever the case may be. But obviously Johnny represents this America not in tune with the sobering realities of life and death. And then they're attacked by the zombie, the older male zombie, who could very well be their father, brought back to life, so to speak, attacking. And Johnny dies in his hands, and Barbara runs. And while Barbara's running, keep in mind, she's running through the field, she's running through open terrain. And if you've watched any kind of film with Vietnam in it, or you've done any research in a history class about Vietnam, you have this image of the open field. And then Barbara finds herself in that quintessential American farmhouse. And then within that quintessential American farmhouse, this notion of the return of the repressed forms. And this is something that Robin Wood and Barry Keith Grant talk about in both of the books I shared earlier, is that the horror film is about the return of the repressed or the oppressed. So that means what we keep inside. The repressed is what we hide away. We don't want to talk about it. The oppressed is kind of who we push to the side. They can coexist. Like Jordan Peele does this quite well with Get Out and Us. The repressed and the oppressed coexist. Our feelings and our realities when it comes to racial tensions and divides in Get Out, but also the fact that Chris in Get Out is an oppressed character. Similar to Night of the Living Dead, where you have all of these repressions and oppression happening. Barbara goes into the house, and who's there? A black man, and he is in kind of this survival savior mode. And right now, in that moment, Romero, he changes the dynamics of our cultural expectations, that when we think of cinematic heroes, we automatically think of the white male, the white savior. Here, he's reimagined it. It's a black man who's quite articulate. He's problem solving. He is, part of wanting to be part of a solution. And he's, without bias, without prejudice, working to also keep Barbara safe. And even when I show this film to my students, when he hits Barbara in that moment of kind of domestic violence, people shrug because it's so real, and it's like, whoa, that actually happened. Well, that's really Romero's moment of, I would argue, the regression. And here he is letting go of all of his frustrations, not just the circumstance and the anxiety of this moment, but he unleashes what society thinks of him as, a black man onto Barbara. And that's not excusing the act, but that's Romero, in that moment, allowing him to be what society thinks he is, and then challenging society to really reflect on the act. And, that idea of that perception that's been created culturally. So Barbara falls, she cries, and then he's keeping them safe. And then throughout the film, something really interesting happens. We discover that there's people in the basement, and there's this family and this couple working to survive. And now we have this division of society happening. We have the white nuclear family downstairs, but we have, safe and protected. And then we have the black man upstairs. And there's a conflict. There's a battle for power then in that moment. And people don't want to listen. People are fighting for control. And so the father really forces his patriarchy, and he wants to be in control, and he's going to put his family and everyone else into great jeopardy. And as this is all happening, the zombies right? The silent kind of majority of the United States is attacking rather the House. And think about who those zombies are. Most of them are kind of white people. They're white Americans. And in much of the literature around Night of the Living Dead, it's the silent majority. And that silent majority living their existence as zombies, not challenging their government, not challenging their way of life, who are really aligned with the status quo, are just feeding off each other, following off each other. They're zombified in their everyday. And so here they are, manifested as monsters. And when we think about the silent majority, we're thinking about those who don't have critical thinking, those who are not deeply cognizant of how their world is founded on constructed norms, and that society is built in a particular way, with particular pillars of power and privilege. And these are not good things, and they're things that need to be explored. But like Romero zombies, people just follow. And when they follow, that's when bad things happen, because they start to cannibalize, or society starts to cannibalize, and people start to cannibalize one another. And that's when we start oppressing people, and people are pushed to the side. And this is where Romero traps all of this stuff into one setting. So all of the stuff of the 1960s, and not just the 1960s, everything before it, into this, one horror film. And that's why it's an American horror film, not just because it was shot in Pittsburgh and Romero's from Pittsburgh, but it's an American horror film about American, deep-rooted issues around race and war and violence and patriarch and family and who has control and who doesn't. So it's grounded in this every day. And then you get to the end of the film where, here he is, the heroic black man. He survives, yet in the morning, the zombies that are alive, if you will, they shoot him dead. And Romero juxtaposes that closing scene with images of, lynching from the South. And it's quite haunting, and it's heartbreaking that this man who was selfless, who was brave, who was a thinker, he was able to survive the Night of the Living Dead, but he wasn't able to survive his living reality. And equally, he's surrounded by a silent majority. Equally, he's surrounded by, cannibalizing white people who are out to kill without rationale and without thinking. And that's Romero's America. And so when we think about horror as a shared anxiety, a collective consciousness, it's really about us. It's a mirror onto ourselves. It's a mirror onto our perhaps inability to be civil. And it's about kind of the monsters that lurk in our everyday. And we see that in the home in Night of the Living Dead, and we also see it within the form of the zombie. So even if you think about what's happening today with all things COVID-19, you're on Twitter, you're seeing the potential of humanity, people, sharing prayers, sharing kind words, sharing birthday messages, sharing GoFundMe pages for perhaps people in precarious work situations, forming online communities. You're seeing so much good, more good than you are negative, mind you, I should note. But then you're seeing people who, are buying bulk hand sanitizer and trying to make a killing, or fraudsters, leveraging this moment of, fear for their own gain. So even in that example, in this example, we have kind of this lurking of evil and this realization that within us, perhaps not the individual, but within our collective, there's a potential for monsters to rise. And that's why sometimes in crisis, horror becomes a therapeutic reflection onto who we are, our sensibilities, our values, what we believe in, a mirror onto our collective consciousness. So if you watch the film, I encourage you to do some deeper reading about it. Look up those books that I shared. Here they are again. You have Robin Wood's on the horror film, and you also have Dread of Difference. And the next film that I'm going to talk about and blog about, if YouTube doesn't allow me to stream, is Jordan Peele's Us, which is not just a film about doppelgangers, but really a film about, the masks we potentially wear. So something to think about during these critical times. Take care of yourself, and watch Us over the next couple of days, and I'll have something ready for it on Monday. Thank you.